Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling one of the most difficult balancing acts in all of negligence law.
It's a really tough one.
We're trying to figure out when an intentional act of self-harm, even, a potential suicide, does not break the chain of causation.
Right, when the original defendant is still on the hook.
To do that, we're jumping into the Massachusetts case of Delaney v. Reynolds. It gives us a really clear, if pretty shocking, roadmap for how courts handle this idea of a superseding cause.
And this is just critical territory for anyone trying to get a handle on tort liability. The law, it usually balks at assigning liability when a plaintiff deliberately hurts themselves.
Of course.
So our mission today is to really analyze how the court in Delaney decided that the defendant's prior knowledge could make an intentional act of self-harm, well, foreseeable.
And we're going to build this up layer by layer.
Exactly. We'll start with the 4 elements of negligence, then zero in on proximate cause, and then apply the really rigorous 3-part test for superseding cause right to the facts of Delaney.
That roadmap is so important because the outcome here, it feels really counterintuitive at first glance. So let's start with that fundamental framework.
Sounds good.
Before we get into the specifics of Delaney, just remind us, where does causation fit into a negligence claim, and what's the standard we're measuring against?
Okay, so negligence always requires 4 elements. First, you need a legal duty.
Right.
Second, a breach of that duty. Third is causation, which is our focus today. And fourth, an actual loss or injury.
And causation itself is split in 2, right?
It is. You have factual cause. The injury wouldn't have happened but for the breach. And then you have proximate cause.
And that's the key here.
That's the key. Proximate cause just means the plaintiff's injury has to be a foreseeable result of the defendant's negligent act.
Okay, so if I breach my duty and the injury is a foreseeable result, the chain is intact. But this case is all about an intervening act. When does a new independent act like the plaintiff shooting herself become so significant that it cuts off the defendant's liability entirely?
That's the doctrine of intervening and superseding causes. So if an independent action happens after the defendant's negligence and helps cause the injury, we call that an intervening cause.
And if that was foreseeable,
then the chain remains intact. The original defendant is still liable if that intervening cause was reasonably foreseeable.
But what if it's something totally shocking, just completely out of the blue?
Then it becomes a superseding cause. If that intervening event was so extraordinary that it couldn't reasonably have been foreseen, it severs liability.
And that gives us our test.
It gives us our test. We can really distill the whole doctrine down into 3 elements. 1, there was initial negligence by the defendant. 2, there was an independent intervening event. And 3, the foreseeability of that event.
Let's apply the structured analysis to the facts that truly mattered in Delaney v. Reynolds. What are the legally dispositive facts?
Okay, so the plaintiff, Kathleen Delaney, was living with the defendant, John Reynolds, who was a police officer. Reynolds kept his service handgun, loaded and unlocked, in places she could easily get to, like a duffel bag or a drawer.
And the context here is critical, right? He knew her situation.
He knew so much. He knew she was getting active treatment for severe clinical depression, for substance abuse, feelings of isolation. He'd even noticed her medications changing.
Wow.
Then, on the night of the injury, she was highly intoxicated, BAC of .165, positive for cocaine, right after they'd had an argument where he told her to move out.
So a very volatile situation.
Extremely. She gets the gun and eventually puts it under her chin and pulls the trigger, causing a grazed but non-fatal injury. But here's the crucial dispute.
The dispute over her intent.
Exactly. Delaney claims she genuinely believed the gun was unloaded when she did it because of a confusing incident that happened earlier where he had told her the gun was empty.
What a devastating set of facts. So given all that, what was the core legal issue facing the court?
The precise legal question was whether Delaney's act of shooting herself was, as a matter of law, an intervening and superseding cause of her injury.
And if it was, that would justify the summary judgment for Reynolds.
It would end the case right there.
So what rule of law did the court apply to sort this out? Could you state the full rule and break it down into its testable elements for us?
Sure. The court applied the rule of proximate cause, but with a modern twist for self-harm cases. The traditional rule is really strict.
How so?
It says a purposeful act of suicide will break the causal chain unless the defendant's negligence basically made the person incapable of resisting a self-destructive impulse.
So it's all about the plaintiff's mental state.
It was. But the modern view, which the Delaney court used, it shifts the focus. It asks, was the risk of self-harm foreseeable based on what the defendant knew?
That's a huge shift. So under this modern view, what are the three elements of the test they actually applied here?
Okay, so they tested three things. One, was Reynolds initially negligent?
Right.
Two, was Delaney's self-shooting an independent intervening act? And three, the big one, was the risk of Delaney's use of that gun, whether she was being intentional or just negligent, reasonably foreseeable to Reynolds?
Thank you. Let's get into the court's elemental analysis. We can just walk through this step by step. How did the court handle the first element, initial negligence?
Well, the trial judge had kind of skipped over this, but the appellate court had to confirm it. The sub-issue is pretty clear. Was leaving a loaded, unsecured gun around a breach of Reynolds' duty of care?
And given what he knew.
A jury could easily say yes, especially knowing her severe mental health and substance abuse issues. The duty of care is just higher when you're dealing with something as dangerous as a firearm. So element one would almost certainly be met.
Understood. That seems straightforward enough. Now what about the second element, the independent intervening act?
This one is purely definitional, very easy. Delaney taking the gun and pulling the trigger it's clearly an independent act that came after Reynolds' negligence.
So the real fight isn't if it intervened, but whether it supersedes.
Exactly. The entire legal battle is on that third element.
Okay, here we go. The core of the case. Let's analyze that third element, foreseeability. You said the court found two critical factual disputes here. What was the first one? About her claim that she thought the gun was unloaded.
This all centers on the question of her intent. If a jury believes Delaney, and on summary judgment, the court has to assume she's telling the truth.
Right.
Then her act was not an intentional suicide attempt. It was negligent handling of a firearm.
Which is much more foreseeable, especially with intoxication involved.
Absolutely. And if it's not an intentional suicide, that traditional, really harsh rule about suicide breaking the chain it doesn't even apply. That dispute alone was enough to send the case to a jury.
Wait, okay, but even if the jury later found she did intend to kill herself, the court still reversed the summary judgment. Why? I mean, how does the risk of an intentional self-injury remain foreseeable enough to keep him on the hook?
And that's the policy crux of this entire case. The question for the jury becomes, was this tragic outcome, even if it was intentional, foreseeable, given Reynolds' specific prior conduct and knowledge?
It all comes back to what he knew.
What he knew and what he did. Remember, he knew about the depression, the substance abuse, but the sources. They also note something horrific.
The other claim she made.
Yes. Delaney claimed she told him before that she wanted to die, and his response was to hand her the gun and tell her to, quote, go outside so as not to make a mess in his house.
That is just a shocking allegation.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And if it's true, which the court has to assume for this review, it dramatically increases the foreseeability that she might use his unsecured weapon to harm herself.
It makes the act less extraordinary in legal terms.
It makes it tragically ordinary in that specific context and highly, highly foreseeable to him.
And after walking through all those elements and those two huge factual questions, what was the court's final conclusion?
They reversed the summary judgment. The appellate court sent the case back for a full trial. They concluded that foreseeability is, and I quote, almost always one of fact for the jury.
So the judge just got it wrong by making that call himself?
Exactly. The judge erred. There were two massive questions of fact. One, did she intend to injure herself? And two, even if she did, was that outcome foreseeable because of everything Reynolds knew and allegedly did?
This brings up a really important question about scope, about the required connection between the defendant's mistake and the final harm. Let's use that visceral hypothetical to make it clear.
Okay.
If Reynolds had been perfect about securing his gun, it's locked up, safe.
Yeah.
But Delaney, still intoxicated and suicidal, finds a bottle of drain cleaner in the house and drinks it. Would Reynolds be liable then just because he knew she was suicidal?
No. And this is so crucial for you to understand. The key is the connection, the nexus, between the specific breach and the specific injury. Reynolds' breach was leaving the gun unsecured. If the injury comes from a totally separate thing, the poison, then the negligence about the gun is not the proximate cause.
The chain is broken.
The chain is broken. His breach created the risk of harm from the firearm, not a general risk of self-harm from anything in the house.
That clarifies the scope perfectly. It's not just general foreseeability of any harm, it's foreseeability of harm linked directly to the specific danger the defendant negligently created, in this case, the gun.
Precisely. The breach and the injury have to be aligned.
So to apply this effectively on, say, an exam, You need a checklist.
You need an actionable diagnostic checklist for proximate cause whenever you see self-harm or any other kind of intentional intervening act.
Okay, let's synthesize everything we've talked about into that tool.
Here's the framework. Number 1, spot the nexus. The moment you see an intervening act, identify the instrumentality. Is the final harm directly connected to the risk the defendant's breach created?
If he leaves a gate open and someone trips on a rug inside, the nexus is gone.
Exactly. Number 2, identify the breach. Be specific. What exact duty did the defendant fail to meet? Here, it was the duty to secure a dangerous weapon from a known vulnerable person.
Okay, what's next?
Number 3, the big one, test foreseeability. Was the intervening act reasonably within the scope of the risk? And remember, if the defendant knew about a specific vulnerability, depression, substance abuse, that makes the risk way more foreseeable.
And the plaintiff's intent.
That's number 4. Check intent. If the act was self-inflicted, is there a factual dispute? Is it accidental versus intentional? If intent is disputed, it must go to the jury.
And finally, the backstop.
Number 5, the knowledge check. This is the policy backstop. Even if the act was intentional, did the defendant's prior knowledge or specific actions make it foreseeable? If he knew about the suicide risk and basically handed over the means, the harm is almost always going to be deemed foreseeable.
That framework brings a lot of clarity to a very, very murky area of law. We've seen that even an act of intentional self-harm might not be a superseding cause if the defendant's negligence and their knowledge made that tragic outcome highly foreseeable.
Indeed. The core lesson here for you is to always, always challenge the conclusion that an intervening act is extraordinary as a matter of law. When you have specific facts, like Reynolds knowing about the depression and the horrific prior conversation, the outcome can be seen as legally foreseeable.
Which moves the question out of the judge's hands and into the jury box.
And that's where it belongs.
So what does this all mean for you as you're reviewing this deep dive? The provocative thought to consider is this. In liability law, when a defendant knows about a plaintiff's specific mental state, does the court shift its focus from the plaintiff's actual intent? Did she really try to kill herself? And more toward what the reasonable defendant should have known? Which factor really carries more weight in shifting that responsibility back to the initial wrongdoer? Keep that tension in mind as you review your notes.